Conference, please give a really warm welcome to Rebecca Long-Bailey, the Salford and Eccles MP.
Thanks everybody. Can you hear me all right at the back? Good stuff. Well, I just want to thank you before I start for letting me come to speak to you today. There's always been a parking space in my heart for the Bakers Union. It was one of the first unions to support Jeremy and the team behind him when we started off 2 years ago, and the support that the Bakers Union have given us has been unwavering through some very, very dark times. And I want to thank you for the support that you've given us, because we needed to have that support. And when we feel like we're standing on the shoulder of giants like yourselves and the people in your movement, then it gives us the strength to carry on. Now, I don't need to tell you that there's something big happening in politics at the minute. And up until last week, I thought that I was a little bit deluded when I kept telling everybody that we were going to do really well in the election. Now, I honestly thought that we were going to win. But we did very, very well compared to what the pollsters said we were going to do, and compared to people, and in fact in our own party, expected us to do. We got seats that we haven't had in decades, and we managed to increase majority significantly. I know mine in Salford and Eccles went from 12,000 majority to nearly 20,000, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. And when I was out door knocking throughout the campaign, I could feel that something had changed. When our manifesto was leaked, whoever leaked that, we still don't know, but I felt that something changed overnight. People were actually talking about our policies, about what we were going to do, about bringing the water companies into public ownership, about a £10 living wage, about giving more power and strength to trade unions. People were actually discussing that on the doorstep, whereas a year before that, they were talking about who was arguing with who, and they weren't really getting what the Labour Party stood for or what we believed in. And even in the last few days of the campaign, I went to a few different constituencies, all different types of constituencies, and I saw pictures of Jeremy Corbyn in people's windows. Now, I've never seen anything like that in my lifetime. I've never seen rallies like the ones that we had for Jeremy, where we had thousands of people turning up. I've never been part of such an energetic campaign, where, like last week, for example, we had a gig in Warrington and we had loads of people turning up, and normally in the Labour Party you'd struggle to get young people to turn up to anything. It was like pulling teeth. But we had loads of them raving away at the front and shouting for Jeremy Corbyn, and I thought, this is it, this is the future. And if we do nothing else in this election, at least we've inspired another generation to get excited about socialism. Now, it's always been there, socialism, and you know more than anybody the struggles that our movement's been through in the last 30, 40, 50 years. Now, where I'm from, we've got a place called Bexley Square, and I know there's a few Salford people in the audience here, yay! You'll know where Bexley Square is as well. And every May Day, we go with our trade union movement to Bexley Square, and we commemorate what happened, because in 1931, 10,000 unemployed people marched to Bexley Square to protest against cuts to unemployment benefit and cuts to other support that they were receiving, and cuts to coal, which is the equivalent of the winter fuel allowance, if you like. And when they were protesting in Bexley Square, they got turned upon by the police, and it became known as the Battle of Bexley Square, because thousands of men and women were attacked with batons, and it was a dark day for our trade union movement. But this May, I started to think about it, and while we were commemorating it and looking at the plaque and talking about our trade union movement, I thought to myself, since 1931, not much has changed. Despite those struggles, despite the people that came after them, those miners, those people in industries who lost their jobs, standing up for what they believed in, we don't seem to have made significant progress. Over the last 7 years, we've got a government that tore apart our public services. They starved industry of investment and they cut benefits for the most vulnerable. Last year alone, we had over 100,000 children not living in a home that they could call their own. 4 million children living in abject poverty. In every year, we've got street homelessness rising at a frightening rate. And then we've got the lowest rate of house building since the 1920s. And then we've had policies, really horrific policies, like the benefit cap, which have forced people, often older people, to have to choose between switching the central heating on or paying their rent. We've had benefit sanctions where people have been sanctioned for the most absurd reasons. I had one guy who was sent to a forklift truck driving course at the same time as his appointment at the job centre. So obviously he did the right thing and he went to the forklift truck driving course thinking that that was most likely to get him a job in the future, went back to the job centre the next day and said, sorry, but I assumed you'd want me to go for the appointment at the forklift truck course. And they said, oh, well, I know it's difficult and I know that you couldn't be in two places at once, but unfortunately the system says that we have to give you a benefit sanction. You're just going to have to appeal it. So the man was sanctioned and he didn't have anything to live on. He had to come to our office and we had to try and get him help from a food bank. There's another story of a man who was diabetic and he'd been to the job centre. He was disabled and he was on a job seeker's contract and they'd asked him to sign a new version of his contract. And he said, well, I don't want to sign a new version of the contract. I'm happy with the one I've got. Why do I need to change it? And they kept, trying to pressure him in to sign this new contract. And eventually he said, well, look, I don't want to sign the new contract. I haven't had time to read it. I just want to stick on the old one. Give me the other one to take home and I'll have a read of it. And they said, no, we're not. If you don't leave here today, you're going to be sanctioned. So he's like, right, well, I'm not signing this under duress, so you're going to have to sanction me. So they sanctioned him, and they sanctioned him for over 3 months. He couldn't afford to buy food. He couldn't afford to put his electricity on. He couldn't afford to put the medicine that he needed to regulate himself in the fridge. And after a few months, he got into such a state, so ashamed he didn't want to go and speak to his family or his friends to tell them what situation or predicament he was in. And he eventually ended up losing his leg. And then he came to us. We helped with Salford Unemployed Resource Centre, who does some fantastic work helping people with benefit sanctions. We put in an appeal, and within weeks, the appeal was granted, and he got the 3 months' money back. And I just thought, that's absolutely shocking. That man has lost his leg in a Britain that simply doesn't care about him. That's not the kind of society I want us to live in, and it's certainly not the kind of society that Jeremy Corbyn wants us to live in. I mean, and that's just one extreme situation, but we've got other issues like zero-hour contracts. We've got people walking for miles every day to go to jobs, only to be told that there's no work and having to walk all the way back again, akin to the type of thing that we saw on our streets in the 1930s, where people queued up at the docks only to be turned away when there wasn't any work. We've got people who are in work that are earning so little they're having to go to food banks, where 2 parents are in work, practically in full-time jobs, and they have to come to food banks every week just to make ends meet. And I get really angry because the people of Britain, and certainly the people of Salford and Eccles, where I am, we've done everything that was asked of us. We pulled up our bootstraps, as the Tory would say. We tried to get jobs. We've tried to better ourselves. We've tried to save a house. We tried to encourage our children to try and get out of the poverty trap, like my parents did. It's like, work hard and you won't have to struggle like we will. If you get to university, it'll all be all right. But for the generation that we've got today, it's not all right, because they're having to pay £40,000 when they go to university just to pay for their fees. And at the end of it, there's no guarantee of a job. So if there's no guarantee of a job for people that have come out of university, what hope is there for the rest of us? Now, you've got pensioners as well, and we saw what happened in the general election with pensioners. This government didn't have 1 ounce of respect for British pensioners. We already have a situation where pensioners are living hand to mouth. They're already having the rug pulled from under them, especially the women that were born in the 1950s. They're having the goalposts moved in terms of the amount that they'll receive and the age that they'll receive their pension at. The government has already proposed that they're going to get rid of the triple lock, which means that if there's unforeseen circumstances and fluctuations in the economy, pensions will go down. The government said that they were going to have a look at getting rid of the winter fuel allowance for the vast majority of pensioners. And I think most pensioners now feel like they've been kicked in the teeth because it makes a mockery of the system that they grew up under, the system that we built as a Labour Party in 1945 that said, if you work hard, you pay your stamps and you pay into the system, we'll look after you when you need it. We'll make sure that you've got a pension. We'll make sure that you've got social care. Well, all of that's been stripped away now at a very, very frightening rate. Now, the government tried to convince us all, as you know, that all of this was necessary. All the attacks on the vulnerable, the attacks on pensioners, the attacks on our public services, it was all necessary because of the financial crash in 2008. That we all had to tighten our belts and it would all be okay in a few years' time, that we'd all see the fruits of our labour and there'd be roses in the garden once again. Well, we know that that isn't true. And I think the vast majority of the British public are realising that that's not true either. Because at the same time as imposing all of these horrific cuts and horrific austerity policies, the government has cut taxes for an extremely small proportion of wealthy people, and they've cut benefits and support for the vast majority of people. So it's a Britain for the few, not the many. And I think what was frightening, and we saw a lot of this in the Brexit campaign, so it's nothing new, they encouraged us to start to blame each other instead of the Tories or instead of those that were actually kind of doing very well. They encouraged us to blame our next door neighbours, benefit scroungers, disabled people, immigrants. They tried to blame the state of the NHS on immigrants, for crying out loud, and they thought that we would fall for it. They told us not to be angry at the government for running down our schools and hospitals, be angry at the immigrants or the woman or the unemployed man. But it wasn't them that crashed the economy. It was greed that crashed the economy. And this greed has been continuing for the last 7 years under this government. It's a government that allowed multinational corporations and the financially elite to hide their money in the Cayman Islands. They allowed people like Philip Green to asset strip great British companies, leaving workers jobless and destitute while he sails around the Mediterranean on his super yacht. They slashed taxes for the most wealthy at the same time as dismantling our public services, and they allowed their friends to share the spoils. And don't be under any illusion if they tell you that their agenda isn't to privatise the NHS, because it is. Jeremy Hunt wrote a book about it in 2010, and everything that was in that book has come to fruition so far. Now, Jeremy said when he started his election campaign that they think that there are rules in politics, that if you don't doff your cap to powerful people, you won't get on and you won't win. But they didn't want us to win. And even though we didn't win the election last week, I think we proved that we don't have to play by their rules, we don't have to play their games, and we don't have to doff our cap to powerful people, because when people fight together in solidarity, we win. Now, he said also that we didn't fit into their cosy club, and we certainly don't. We're not obsessed with the tittle-tattle of Westminster or what happens in the media or what happens in the polling organisations. We don't accept that we have to be governed by an elite, that people just have to take what they're given. And you know what? That's what we set out in our manifesto. This wasn't a manifesto that tried to be popular. It wasn't a manifesto that just tinkered around with things and said, well, we'll change a few things, but we know we really can't change the world. We tried to change the world. This was one of the most exciting manifestos we've ever seen. It looked to transform society, to transform our economy, and make sure that we had a Britain for the many, not the few, where prosperity reached out to everywhere, where people had more rights at work, where people felt more secure, and people, do you know what? They just felt like they had a future, and they felt like they had hope. We said that we'd make sure that our public services would get the funding that they needed. We said that we'd invest in business, and one of the things that I was involved in was building an industrial strategy. And the Tories, and the media commentators, time and time again, they say, well, it's all right spending the money, but where are you going to get the money from? We set out a comprehensive and detailed industrial strategy to show where the money would come from, to show how we were going to grow businesses over the next 20, 30 years, to show how much we were going to invest in innovation to make sure that we were at the forefront of the world. How much press coverage did it get? None. Because they're not interested in finding out how we're going to make our money. We've said that we're going to give workers better pay and security at work, and you already know that we fully support one of the main campaigning policies of the Bakers Union for a £10 living wage. We've said that we were going to ban 0 hours contracts. We've said that we wanted to give trade unions access to every single workplace. And we've said that we want to set out a charter for workers' rights. And if you get time, some of you have probably read it already, but if you get time after today, do have a look at the Labour Party webpage and check out our charter for workers' rights, because the things that I've just mentioned are just a few of a 20-point list that we've got on workers' rights, because we want to turn back the clock in terms of the backward steps that we've made in terms of attacks to our workers' rights and our trade union movement. Now, we said that we wanted to rebuild the economy. We wanted to build a Britain for the many, not the few. And what happened last week, I think, is stage one. So don't be disheartened that we lost the general election. We did better than anybody thought we would. And mark my words, we'll be in another general election by the end of this year or by the beginning of next year. So the beginning of our election campaign starts today. And it will be difficult because the establishment and certain parts of the media know that Jeremy goes down well with people. They know people like our policies, and they'll move heaven and earth to try and damage us and to make sure that our arguments don't get out there. So we've got to make sure that we're out there on the streets, not just when the election's called now, but from tomorrow, this weekend, that we're out knocking on doors, speaking to our friends, having chats in the pub. It's already started. I had a guy that works in one of the British Legions in Salford, and he said to me, he said, at the beginning of the campaign, he said, no one liked Jeremy. He said, they were all slagging him off and they hated him. And he said, I've seen things change. And a couple of days before the election, he said, they're all coming in, they think he's great. They're talking about him being a man of the people. So people in pubs are talking about politics again. I mean, how long has it been since we had chats in the pubs about politics? And that's how we spread our message. So get out there and talk to your aunties and your uncles, your granddads, your children. Make sure that they get excited about politics, because when that election is called, we're going to win it this time. We're going to win it, and we're going to make sure that we create a Britain for the many, not the few. Thanks, guys. And just before I go, I just want to say that, like me, you're part of our movement's history. And you're here, like I am, like everyone on this panel is, because you believe that another world is possible. And I know that when you look back at your life, you'll have hand on heart, when you look at yourself in the mirror, you'll say, look, I was a socialist, and I stood up for what I believed in. I was counted when the time came. So get out there and get counted. Thanks, everyone.
As always.